The summer before I was due to go to college, I worked in the office at a car mechanic's garage. One of the mechanics there, called George, started flirting with me almost immediately, and after 2 days of working there, he'd already asked me out. It ended up being a whirlwind romance. He totally swept me off my feet. I introduced him to all my friends, and everyone loved him. But then something bad happened. He called me one night and said he'd been in an accident and broke his arm. He said he wouldn't be able to work for a while and didn't know how he'd pay the rent. I offered to help and said I'd come right over with $1,000. I really needed that money for my first year of college, but I knew he'd pay me back. And he did. The following week, he gave me $200, and then I asked him when he could pay the rest, and that was when things started going downhill. He didn't reply to me. I tried calling him, but suddenly I couldn't get through to him at all. I called his roommate, and he said George was gone. He'd taken everything. His bed, his furniture, it was all gone. I started freaking out. Where had he gone? I contacted everyone I could to ask them, and one guy just hung up on me when I mentioned George's name. Then he texted me and said George owed him a lot of money, and he didn't want to hear anything from him unless it was a message to say he'd paid him back. I was so shocked. What if something had happened to him? Then, a few days later, a friend of his called me and said he thought George had been quite depressed and had gone on some kind of silent meditation retreat to try to clear his head. Okay, that did make sense. I mean, he did enjoy meditating. And then one night, there was a knock on my door. It was late, and I prayed that it would be George, but it wasn't. It was an older woman, and I had no idea who she was. She was crying and said she was George's mom, and that she'd just received news that George had died. I suddenly burst into tears, and we just stood there hugging. She said George had been in a lot of debt, and some gang had killed him. No, I screamed. It couldn't be true. George didn't gamble. But it was true, and I had to learn to come to terms with it. He was gone. He wasn't coming back, and they weren't having a funeral. It took me ages to get over. I almost didn't go to college, but my friends persuaded me it would be good for me, and eventually I met someone new, a guy called Arnold, and it got serious quite quickly. I told him about George, and he was totally sympathetic. A year later, he booked a surprise trip for my birthday, and I was finally starting to feel totally normal again. He rented a car for us to go to a bungalow near a beach, but on the way there, the car suddenly broke down. We were literally in the middle of nowhere, so we had to call around and try to find a garage to come and tow us. It took more than an hour to find somewhere that could help, and then another 30 minutes to be towed there. When we got there, I went and sat down, and I couldn't help but think of George. The last time I'd been in a car garage was when we worked together. Arnold was busy talking to the mechanic, and then he called me over. "Babe, I was just telling the mechanic that you used to work in a garage." I looked up, and I thought I was seeing things. It was George. I felt my whole body go cold, and I honestly thought I was going to pass out. Arnold ran over to me and asked if I was okay. And I told him that was George. It was definitely George. I started shouting his name, and the manager came over and asked if I was okay, and I asked where George had gone. He said there was no one called George here. Then he asked Arnold if maybe I needed to go lie down somewhere. They didn't believe me, but I swear on my life that it was him. I texted his old friends and told him I'd just seen him. And one of them replied straight away and said he believed me, and he'd drive up and try to find him. But then you won't believe what happened. He'd fixed our car and drove off in it. The manager was going crazy and shouting his name. "Bill, you get back here right now or I'll call the cops." And I was standing there screaming that his name was George, not Bill. I then decided to call his mom. She answered and pretended she didn't know who I was, and said her son was alive and well, and that clearly I had something wrong in my head. This was getting weirder and weirder. I called the cops and told them everything, and they said George was on their list of people who had disappeared, and they'd been trying to track him down for the past year and a half. I told him he'd just stolen our car and gave them the registration, and they said they'd try to track him down. And so, because the cops took me seriously, Arnold did too. But they couldn't find him. However, they did go to his mom's house, and turns out that she'd been trying to protect him by helping him fake his own death because he was in so much debt. And he'd threatened her, saying he'd sell her house if she didn't go along with his death. I felt sick. This was crazy. So he dated me just to get money from me. And the whole time, I thought he loved me. I felt so stupid. Well, surely the cops will catch him soon. I mean, it can't be that hard to find him. And when they do, he is going to be in serious trouble. He owes so many people so much money. Now, I was actually grateful our car had broken down. Otherwise, we'd never have found out he was still alive. Although I'm annoyed, too, because our bags and my purse were in the car.